Good afternoon, and welcome to the Yale University Art Gallery. My name is Stephanie Wiles, and I'm the Henry J. Heinz II Director, and it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce Professor David Blight, and he will introduce our distinguished panelists after me. Professor Blight is the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, and Sterling Professor of History here at Yale University. Before coming to Yale in 2003, he was Professor of History and Black Studies at Amherst College. Professor Blight has written and edited over a dozen books on slavery and abolition. Of his many critically acclaimed works, I'd like to highlight his most recent book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2019. Among his many scholarly accomplishments, Blight also generously shares his remarkable expertise through his work on boards of museums and historical societies, including serving as an advisor to the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. He also was elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're really honored to have Professor Blight join us today as the moderator for this panel conversation, The Legacy of Lynching, Artistic Confrontations of Racial Terror, presented in association with the exhibition Reckoning with the Incident, John Wilson's Studies for a Lynching Mural. The exhibition was curated by Lisa Hoda-Marsky, the gallery's Sutphin family curator of prints and drawings, and Pamela Franks, the class of 1956 director of the Williams College Museum of Art. John Wilson's work is compelling, incredibly powerful. It's on view in the fourth floor galleries of the Yale Art Gallery. And if you have time, we are open until 8 p.m. tonight. And I would just encourage everyone, if you can make it, please see this powerful exhibition. Today's program was made possible by the generosity of the Gilder Lehrman Center for Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and the Yale Art Gallery's Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund. So thank you again very much for coming, and thank you, Professor Blight, for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and Lisa, congratulations on the exhibition. The John Wilson exhibition, we just all got to see it up on the fourth floor, and I would encourage you to go up. My colleague Lou DeBacca just handed me, this is his phone. Yes, the old style was you get a note in the pocket. Now the New York Times just put up a huge new piece on the new exhibition at the Whitney Museum in New York about a Mexican muralists and their tremendous influence on American artists, North American artists. So check it out, Mexican muralist influence on U.S. artists. I'm here primarily just to introduce this panel and then moderate a bit later. It's actually a thrill for me to welcome two very good friends on this panel and now two new friends. And each of them is going to take about 10 minutes. It's a shame couldn't give them all more than 10 minutes to reflect on the legacies of lynching and perhaps on this image as well, or images. And then we'll have a discussion amongst us for a little while, and then we are saving time for audience questions and comments. There are many ways to think about how one even talks about or chooses to see the legacies of lynching. At the Gilder Lehrman Center, we've just launched a project. We're calling it the Legacies of Slavery. We're doing it with the Council of Independent Colleges, which is a vast network of small colleges. We're doing it under a Mellon Foundation grant. We identified 9, this wasn't simple to do, but we identified 9 distinct legacies of slavery. They're all broad enough that a lot fits under each of those rubrics. One of them is cultural creativity, how slavery and its aftermath, its many aftermaths, has been processed in art, in music, in sculpture, in landscapes, in cultural memory. A number of you are no doubt experts on African American literature or history, and you know that in the 20th century, it was the rare African American artist or poet who didn't at some point, if not frequently, represent a lynching of some kind or some kind of violence in their work. There's so many examples of ritualized violence appearing in black literature, from the late slave narratives to fiction of all kinds in the 20th century. This tradition may actually begin with William Wells Brown's novel, published in 1853, well before the Civil War, called Clotel, where an impudent, quote, impudent slave is ritually executed and indeed burned before a huge crowd of some 4,000 fellow slaves. There's Charles Chestnut's famous novel, The Marrow of Tradition, which is based upon, rooted in the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina coup, an event about which I'm currently reading a new book by an author named Zucchino, a book called Wilmington's Lie. Then there is Pauline Hopkins' work called Contending Forces, published in 1900, which made central themes out of mob violence, the rape of black women, and a kind of intergenerational transmission of such a history. And there's so many other examples. Walter White's Fire in the Flint, published in 1924, which ends with a ritualized lynching and burning. My own favorite example of all of this literary cultural memory comes from James Weldon Johnson, an African-American intellectual and writer we know well at Yale, because his papers are here. I hope you know him better in a few years, because I'm writing a new biography on him. Actually, more than a few years, probably. But you may remember, if you've read Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, that it ends with ex-colored man in the post-Reconstruction era, somewhere in the Deep South, saying this about a scene he witnesses at the very end of the book. He's passing, and therefore he can watch what he doesn't want to watch. I quote him, "A railroad tie was sunk into the ground, the rope was removed, and a chain brought and securely coiled around the victim and the stake. There he stood, a man only in form and stature. His eyes were full and vacant, indicating not a single ray of thought. Fuel was brought from everywhere, oil, the torch, the flames, crouched for an instant as though to gather strength, then leaped up as high as the victim's head. He squirmed, he writhed, strained at the chains, then gave out cries and groans that I shall always hear. His eyes, bulging from their sockets, rolled from side to side, appealing in vain for help. I was fixed to the spot where I stood, powerless to take my eyes from what I did not want to see." What I think I've always appreciated most about that passage is the last words, because it may be James Weldon Johnson saying America doesn't want to see this. It's what Americans don't want to see. Maybe none of us want to see what lynchings really were. But thank God for the artist, because sometimes they can see what we either can't or don't or won't. Okay, I'm going to quickly introduce our panel in the order they will speak, And then each is going to come to the podium because three of the four are using a PowerPoint. And then when we're done, we'll all gather up here with the water bottles. It's a great thrill to introduce Fitz Brundage again. We've had him here for a number of other events. I'm going to embarrass him just for a second. I often get asked, even by graduate students in seminars, so who's your favorite historian, or who's your favorite historian on this subject or that subject? And the answer is, well, there are two or three, but Fitz is one of them. We've known each other a long time. I don't even know how long. He writes on very difficult subjects, and he writes brilliantly on those subjects. He has written a book on socialist utopias in Tennessee and Georgia. He did his first book called Lynching in the New South, which was a study of lynching in Georgia and Virginia. He's the editor of batches of essays on all sorts of subjects about Southern history, Southern memory. He wrote a stunning book called The Southern Past, A Clash of Race and Memory. He's edited a book on blackface and cultural memory. And most recently, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Publicly, Fitz, I'm sorry. It was a finalist last year. His amazing book called Civilizing Torture, An American Tradition. And to just lighten up his life a bit, his next book is on Civil War prisons. Our second speaker is Crystal Feimster, my colleague here in African American Studies and History departments. Crystal did her PhD at Princeton. She's been here at Yale now, I don't know, 6, 7 years or more. Her first book was entitled Southern Horrors, Women and the Politics of Rape and Lynching, which focused, as I'm sure some know, on two important writers about that subject from very different perspectives, Ida B. Wells and Rebecca Latimer Felton. And she's now working on a book on rape during the American Civil War more broadly. She has won at least 2 teaching awards here at Yale, including the Mentor of the Year award for graduate students, which is a really nice and coveted prize because it means it's the graduate students who make that happen. It's not just some committee that decides, it's the graduate students who actually decide. Anyway, Crystal will be our second speaker, and you can see the relevance of the work of these 2 historians to this difficult but so important subject. So we start with the 2 historians to lay all the context, or some of it, in 10 minutes each. Our third speaker will be Jonathan Kubakundimana. How'd I do? I've been practicing. Jonathan is program manager for the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. That's, for those of you who haven't been there, the must-see new museum in the United States. It used to be the African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington. That still is, but the Montgomery Museum, rooted in the life and work of Brian Stevenson, is now the must-see museum. Anyway, Jonathan is their program manager. He graduated from Furman University in South Carolina with a degree in political science. He joined the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, after working for a U.S. district judge in South Carolina. He is a survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. So Jonathan comes to this story, this problem, partly by professional interest, but obviously also by experience. He's involved in research and writing and all sorts of community outreach for the Peace and Justice Museum and the National Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, and he will be presenting about that museum, and I'm sure we'll take some questions as well, especially for those of you who may not have actually visited. Jonathan works with the teams that go out to communities to try to help communities that have actually had historical lynchings find ways to face that past. And you even work with the groups that go out to get the soil to bring back, which is a key part, a key visual part of what's displayed at that museum. And finally, our artist on this panel, Ken Gonzales-Day, is a Los Angeles-based artist whose work has been about all sorts of historical constructions about race, about the limits of how we construct race in art. He has done exhibitions about lynching photographs. He created an exhibit entitled Erased Lynching in 2006, and also another publication about lynching in the American West from 1850 to 1935. Consider that chronology. And it has brought a great deal of attention to this story in the American West, which is not intuitively where we think about it. He also launched the project called The Searching for California Hang Trees, another photography exhibition. And he's created as well walking tours of Los Angeles lynching sites. And last but not least, he holds a chair in the history of art at Scripps College in LA, or in the LA area. So that's our panel in the order they will speak. And Fitz, I believe you are first. Thank you. Come on up, sorry.
David's sort of like Columbo, for those of you who don't know him. He's always got all this stuff he's carrying with him, and he's got to get it together. In any case, I want to thank everyone who's made it possible for me to be here. And I have to say to David, thank you for the kind words. You know, if I have to be a runner-up, there's no one I would rather be a runner-up to than David Blight. So, in any case, it's a privilege to be here and participate in this. I'm going to try to keep to that 10-minute limit, so let me actually open up my phone, because David said at 10 minutes he will shoot me if I'm not done, and Bad metaphor. Well, I understand, but still, I take the threat seriously. In any case, what I want to talk about is not so much to set up the historical context of lynching so much as to set up a little context about ways in which particularly African Americans, but not just African Americans, responded to the rise of lynching in the 1880s and around the turn of the 20th century, and the challenges that opponents to lynching faced in trying to come up with a way to turn American attitudes against lynching. And they confronted a challenge that most of the information they knew about lynching and most of the information most Americans had about lynching came from newspapers, mainly white newspapers, since there were comparatively few African American newspapers. And so the media context for the discussion of lynching was dominated, of course, by whites, and dominated by whites who were openly tolerant of the practice of lynching. So opponents of lynching faced severe opposition. Let me see if I'm operating this correctly. And I have up here 3 examples. We're going to hear more about Ida B. Wells, I'm sure, from Crystal. But the other example up here is Alex Manly down there on the left. Alex Manly was one of the victims of the 1898 insurrection, white supremacist insurrection in Wilmington, North Carolina. And the other is J. Max Barber, who was an African-American editor in Atlanta. All 3 of these, as you may know, were driven from their posts as editors and forced into exile in the North. So opponents of lynching were actively silenced in the South in some instances. And those who weren't silenced had to confront long-established and widely shared beliefs about black criminality and violence. And these beliefs weren't just conventional among white journalists and white editors in the South and the North. They were also held by erstwhile right-thinking reformers. So even Jane Addams, the Chicago Uber reformer, couldn't escape the grasp, and she herself voiced opinions that were complicit, if you will, with some of the attitudes that justified lynching. So rare was it that there was a white commentator like Mark Twain who absolutely rejected the shibboleths that justified lynching. So in short, the contest over the legitimacy of lynching between 1880, we'll say, and 1920 was one in which the defenders of lynching had virtually all of the advantages. But I want to talk about the way in which the visual proved to be, I think, the greatest challenge for defenders of lynching, and to suggest that visual representations of lynchings transformed the act of witnessing lynchings. Now, there's ample evidence that white Southerners who joined in the crowds that witnessed lynchings were complicit in the spectacles. They were present. They seldom did anything to stop them. And their participation was an essential component of turning lynchings into a ritual of white racial solidarity. Scholars such as Amy Wood and others have argued that lynching photographs, which were commonplace, performed a similar function. They constructed and perpetuated the white supremacist ideology by creating permanent images that depicted African Americans as helpless and powerless, and of a controlled white citizenry punishing those African American bodies. Other visual representations elicited similar responses. Of course, the most famous is perhaps, or infamous, I should say. You'll get a little whiplash as I move through this, but this is the scene of those of you who know D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. This is a scene of Gus, the African-American, it's obviously a white man, in fact, but an African-American character who attempts to assault a young virginal white girl. But I want to suggest here that I'm not persuaded that lynching photographs were as effective as Wood suggested. Visual images of lynching, I contend, were far less stable, far less circumscribed in their meanings than we may assume at first glance. And on top of that, visual images are promiscuous. So virtually as soon as the means to inexpensively and comparatively easily reproduce images of lynchings became possible, opponents of lynchings seized upon that. And let me just use one example here. This is from the newspaper, The Richmond Planet, which was edited by John L. Mitchell in Richmond, Virginia. In 1895, he finally had the means with his newspaper to begin to introduce his own cartoons. And you can see they're a little rustic. But by the middle of 1895, he's already reproducing this photograph of dangling bodies. And he included that photograph every issue of his newspaper above a list that he kept adding to of all of the victims of lynching. So he's already, literally as soon as he had the capacity, he was starting to reproduce in photographs and cartoons as ways to continue his critique visually of lynching. Now, here's an image that I apologize for. There are a few images that I'm going to show that are deeply troubling, and this is one of them. This is a photograph by a white photographer in Lawrenceville, Georgia. You can see the African-American victim, Charlie Hale, hanging from the light post. I draw your attention to this because this is a visualization. This is a kind of idealization of the Southern lynch mob. It's well ordered. We have the lawmen with their bloodhounds in the foreground, and then we have the mob, if you will, the crowd gathered around it. Here is the black desperado dealt with through summary execution. And to the extent that there's anything that suggests something out of hand, inappropriate, it might be the sign that is on his feet, which I realize you can't see, a dangling sign on his feet which says, "Do not wake him." White journalists, like photographers, were responsible for taking great pains to depict the decorum of lynching. And I'm going to offer just one quick example about this. In a lynching that was, again, you'll get a little whiplash here. This was printed the day before, I should say, just before the lynching of Charles Scarborough. After this was printed, as you can see, the newspaper predicted what was going to happen. When he was lynched, the newspaper reported there was no excitement in the matter at all. The people were determined that the Negro should pay the penalty for attempted crime. That was all. Now, the problem with visual images of lynching, as we can see from these notorious, infamous photographs of the Waco lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916. These photographs were taken by Fred Gildersleeve. The problem with these photographs is they, of course, conveyed that the ritual of lynching was often not as serene, as tightly controlled as whites would like it to be. And in fact, these photographs were so disturbing to the interests of Waco that leading figures in Waco actively discouraged Gildersleeve from circulating these photographs because of the damage they did to Waco's image. And in light of that, you can understand why white Southern apologists would have preferred that images of lynchings not be circulated, and why they almost certainly endorsed the refusal of the US Post Office to distribute lynching photographs after 1908. Now, visual representations of lynching victims also troubled defenders of lynching because they shifted the focus away from the alleged act that elicited the vengeance to the victim of the lynch mob. And I just draw your attention to probably one of the most famous archetypal representations of not only black criminality, but also white vengeance. And I return now, again, to D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. Those of you who have not seen the movie, you're lucky, you didn't waste 3 hours of your life. But on the other hand, it is still a remarkable catalog. As you may know, the real climax of the movie in many ways is Gus chasing Flora, as you can see up at the top. Then she climbs on top of this cliff, and rather than be caught by Gus, she throws herself off. Well, recall that the actual execution of Gus warrants no extended attention by Griffith. Far more time, literally minutes, is spent depicting Flora's fleeing from Gus. Only a matter of seconds are devoted to Gus's actual execution. Now, I wanted to give you an account, and I'm just going to quickly summarize this, of this event here. This is a lynching that happened in Polk County, Florida in 1900. And I'll just summarize what I was going to tell you at greater length very quickly here, which is to say the original news account from the local newspaper describes this as a fight between two men, a black man and a white man, at their place of work. And it ends up with the black man killing the white man and then friends of the white man murdering the African American. Well, when this story then gets told by the Tampa Tribune, you can see the white man is beheaded by this Negro brute, and he is a desperado. That is, the black man who beheads the white man is a desperado. The white man is the salt of the earth and is a leading figure in the community. And it was a contrived, anticipated, what would be the right word, premeditated murder. So I use this as an example of the way in which, in the context in which white newspapers controlled the reporting about lynching. If you opened up a newspaper, you were going to get an account that justified lynchings, that presented lynchings, as this Tampa Tribune article did, as somehow the justified response of a white community to some sort of outrage. But visual images of lynchings were not as easily curated. Outside of film, most images of lynchings located the violated body, the violated black body in the foreground. I'm not suggesting that simply depictions, I'm at 11 minutes. Give me 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes. Whew. It's getting. So, outside of the film, they want you to go on. All right, most visual images, as I said, focused on the violated African American body. And I'm not suggesting that, given the power of the ideology of white supremacy, that images of mutilated, tortured African American bodies necessarily evoked empathy or sympathy from white viewers. But nevertheless, I think the minute, if you will, the minute the attention is drawn to the body of the lynching victims and away from the precipitating crime in the white imagination, it transformed how lynching would be discussed. And it also meant that artists, visual artists, representing lynching were able to draw on a deep reservoir of visual references to challenge the legitimacy of lynching. Arguably, the deepest vein exploited by artists was that of nearly 2 millennia of depictions of Christian martyrdom. Whereas the Western art tradition, as you all know, discouraged representations of African American bodies, of black bodies. The Western art tradition was rife with renderings of martyrs. And I was going to return there, but here's what I want to get to. We have George Bellow's remarkable piece from 1922, The Law is Too Slow, on the right, but classic imagery of Christian martyrdom on the left. Or it didn't take great imaginative leaps to invoke the martyrdom of Christ when rendering the execution of lynching victims. The lynching tree would dissolve into the cross, and the lynch mob into Roman spectators. And on the top, I realize these are too small for you to see in any detail. Of course, there are thousands of images of Christ on the cross, and these are just a selection of images mainly from the 1932 and 1935 shows of artists opposed to lynching, in which they invoke the cross. And finally, another powerful cultural trope that visual artists could draw upon were representations of lynching victims as scapegoats. And here I just draw, these are two images. One on the top, which may be hard for you to see, is a woman holding up a young child, a young girl, saying this is her first lynching. And the other is to the lynching down here on the right. So my point is that here we see artists who draw attention to the license for sadism provided under the guise of communal justice. So once the lynching victim was surrounded by these rich cultural references, the possibility of eliciting sympathy becomes conceivable. And artists, especially between the wars, proved remarkably adept at transforming the hitherto scorned lynching victim into the nation's most conspicuous contribution to the long history of humankind's seemingly limitless capacity for hypocrisy, cruelty, and evil. And almost certainly some of these artistic renderings that I've shown today, as well as nameless other photographs of lynching victims, were what familiarized John Wilson, a black child growing up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, with the American tradition of lynching. And so too, by 1955, 3 years after Wilson created the incident, when Mamie Till Bradley's son Emmett was lynched in Money, Mississippi, she understood the degree to which the visual archive of lynching had delegitimized the practice. Thus, she elected to let the world see and photograph the bloated and mutilated corpse of her son Emmett. Perhaps no other act better illustrated how fully the visual images of lynching advanced the work of suppressing what Mark Twain called the nation's epidemic of bloody insanities. Thank you.
I told Fitz he could have a few of my minutes. I think it's the least I could do. Fitz and I go way back. When I was a graduate student working on my dissertation on lynching, he really hooked me up with some sources and really kind of welcomed me into the world of scholars who were thinking about racial violence, and actually introduced me to my current colleague, Jacqueline Goldsby, who was also working on her first book, which was on lynching as well, through a conversation that the three of us had in Chicago many years ago. I don't know if you remember that. So I'm happy to let him have some of my minutes. But let me also thank the Yale Art Gallery and the Gilder Lehrman Center for organizing this and inviting me to be a part of the conversation. So beginning in the 1880s, journalists, photographers, historians, novelists, artists, sociologists, and activists began producing images similar to John Wilson's The Incidents. They did it through words, through images, drawings, and a lot of the images that you actually saw during Fitz's presentation were part of art exhibits in 1935 in New York City. They kind of ran back to back. One was organized by the NAACP, and the other was organized by Communist Party affiliates and organizations. And they were actually strangely in competition with each other. They tried to kind of push the other one out, and they had very different agendas and different calls for what they wanted the anti-lynching movement to do. But those images that they produced, and many of them that you saw were mostly of black men, and many of them tended to be graphic. The Communist Party exhibited, tried to not just use images of black men as victims of lynching, but tried to produce other images that captured what they saw as the political and economic implications of lynching. So some of those images were a little less graphic. They were racial images of black and white workers marching in solidarity, a host of ways in which they tried to mobilize the idea of lynching as being not just about brutal violence. While lynch mobs murdered Italians, Chinese, Mexicans, Native Americans, and attacked women and children, the majority of the images produced over the last century bring into focus black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Indeed, the strange fruit hanging from the poplar tree is almost always imagined and depicted in media accounts, sociological documents, literature, history, protest politics, and the visual arts as a public spectacle centered on the terroristic and deadly subordination of the black male body by Southern mobs of white men. Now, there's a reason, and maybe a logical reason, for why most people have been focused on black men. One is that black men represent the majority of victims of Southern lynch mobs, that the lynchings that were most brutal and the most horrible in the sense that people were tortured, that their deaths were prolonged, their lives were prolonged just so that they could prolong the torture, tended to be black men, and that those were the images that were mostly circulated in the press. You know, they would get picked up, and I don't mean images in the sense of photographs, but if some of the clippings that Fitz put up or graphic descriptions, right, that created images, not so different from the one that David Blight read in his introduction, right, that one of my colleagues, and Fitz's colleague, Jacqueline Dow Hall, talked about as kind of a pornography, right? On the one hand, it makes sense that black men are at the center of that narrative, but in my own work, I argue that that particular narrative and those particular images do work to kind of mask the concrete realities of how violence functions in the lives of black and white women in the South. A woman lynched, reported the New York Times on August 20th, 1886. In two sentences buried at the bottom of page 3, the reporter explained that Eliza Wood, colored, was taken by a mob from a jail in Jackson, Tennessee, and hanged for poisoning her employer, Mrs. Jessie Woolen. Down in Memphis, a 24-year-old Ida B. Wells wrote an article for the Gate City Press, a black newspaper in Kansas City, Missouri, protesting the lynching. In her diary, she worried that her editorial, in which she almost advised murder, was too militant, and expressed her fear that Southern whites would retaliate. She raged. A colored woman accused of poisoning a white one was taken from the county jail and stripped naked and hung up in the courthouse yard, and her body riddled with bullets and left exposed to view. Oh my God. Can such things be and no justice for it? In 19th century America, the answer to Wells' heart-wrenching question was obviously no. Eliza Wood's name now appears on one of the columns at the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Mob violence against Black women who were the targets of not only lynching but rape by white men has all too often been ignored and forgotten. When most Americans imagine lynching, they almost always envision the tortured and mutilated body of a Black man accused of raping a white woman. Rarely evoked is the image of the Black woman stripped naked and hung. Yet, as Wells learned as a young woman coming of age in the South, Black women were not only victims of Southern mob violence, but were also targets of rape by white men, which, like lynching, was used to terrorize Black communities. Wells would go on to also find out and eventually talk and write about white women also as victims of mob violence. And she would spend a lot of her sort of currency talking about Black and white women as a way to undermine the myth that lynching functioned to protect white womanhood, that it was about a chivalrous white manhood. Now, when I began researching and writing Southern Horrors, Women in the Politics of Rape and Lynching in the 1990s, I had to consider how I would represent the rape and lynching of women on the written page, and more specifically, what image I would allow to grace the cover of my manuscript. And to be honest, when you finish your dissertation, you just happy to be thinking, oh my God, I'm gonna get a book, I'm gonna have a book cover, and you're kind of like, I don't care. As long as my name on it, it's good to go. And so I didn't initially think very much about the cover of my book. And I think at some point when I did get a contract, I was like, oh, right, I'm going to have a cover. And I initially just thought, I wonder what they're going to put on the cover. And that's something, y'all, if you ain't ever written a book, that's sometimes a fight, let me be clear. You don't always get to choose what's on the cover of your book. And I didn't get to choose what was on the cover of my book, but I felt like I had a say. And it wasn't, when I was doing my research, I found a rare image of an African-American woman who had been lynched in Oklahoma, and she was hanging from a bridge. There were close-up shots. And if you have done any research or tried to find images of Black women who are lynched, this really just this one. And at the time I thought, and people were like, oh, that's great, that'll make a great cover of your book. And I did think, oh yeah, that might be a good cover for my book. And then I had this friend of mine, he was Tim Tyson. His book came out, and it was Radio Free Dixie, and it had on the cover, it was a Black man, and he was showing this Black woman how to shoot a gun, and he didn't get to pick his cover. But people were mad at him about his cover, and he was like, oh, people are mad at me because I got a Black man on the cover, and he's, like Black men are portrayed as violent, and there was all this drama. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I guess I better think about my cover. And that was the first time that I thought, oh, maybe I don't want to put an image of a Black woman hanging on the cover of my book, because I had to, Tim made me think about my audience, and he was white, and he had mostly Black people who were mad, Black men particularly who were mad at him. And so then I thought, well, if I'm thinking about my audience, because I want to bring Black women to the center of this narrative, does that also mean that I want them to see an image of a Black woman lynched? And I thought, they might be mad at me. Like, that might not be, to center Black women may not be to put an image of them. And I did, at some point, negotiate with my press that they could choose my cover, but I didn't want a body on that cover. And as I have lived with my book, I feel good about that, because my kids, they wanted copies of my book. They're 9 and 14, and they're young Black boys, and it has felt safe, like that was the right decision for me to make, not even understanding that it was the right decision at the time. I also struggled about how do you write and describe such graphic violence. And how do you do it in a way that it is not repetitive, that it is not gratuitous, you know, and the question of, are we reinscribing violence when we recount or we show these images? I believe that people need to see the images. I don't think they need to see them all the time, but I think if you were to understand the horrors of lynching, then you have to reckon with the brutality and the violence of that. In writing those narratives, I was selective about which cases I went into graphic detail about, conscious that I wasn't going to do that with all of the cases, but that it was important to do it when I needed to make a particular point about how Black women's bodies were mutilated and sexualized, that I had to talk about the rape, I had to talk about the stripping of the body. So I had to make sort of what I think is intellectual choices, but also choices that I felt would make it possible for my reader to read the book, to get through the book. You know, like artists, I think, or as writers, we have to also consider how we portray these images. And while I was not the first, I'm not the first or the last person faced with the daunting challenge of portraying the horrors of lynching, few have put women at the center of their portrayals of lynching. If women were included, they were often on the margins as the Black mothers or wives of Black men who had been lynched, or white women who had suffered the unspeakable crime of rape at the hands of Black men. We often see them in the corner, as we do in Wilson's. And I understand that this served a political purpose in a society where Black men had been stripped of their manhood, that to have images of them protecting or shielding their Black families and Black women was a political statement and a political act. But in doing that, it also served to erase the roles in which Black women resisted political and economic subordination and were the targets of mob violence as well as their Black sons and husbands. Yet we know that women were not only victims of lynching and participated in mob violence, they were also at the forefront of anti-lynching campaigns. And in recognizing Black women and white women's roles in the anti-lynching campaigns and the arguments that they made against lynching and what I call or argue as an anti-rape movement of the 19th century, it not only forces us to bear witness and reckon with the huge number of Black male victims, it forces us to make sense of and understand the ways in which that racialized violence was sexual violence that really worked to keep Black and white women in submissive and subordinate roles in the South. I'm going to end on that note because we're going to have plenty of time to have a conversation and have questions, but thank you.
I'm going to get my time up here, too. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. There we go. Thank you so much to Professor Blight for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Yale Gallery, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition for inviting EJI to be a part of this. And, you know, before I start, I just have to say how honored I am and thrilled to be sitting on this panel with these distinguished panelists. I've spent a lot of time as a student with your work, and also the work that we do at EJI. We've relied and drawn on pretty heavily from your scholarship and your research, and so it really is a treat and a privilege for me to be here. And you know, as we were talking earlier, the question that Professor Blight offered to us was how do we best see, represent, and explain the phenomenon of lynching in America? And I think there's a lot in that question. And to start with this first part, how do we see lynching in America? At EJI, I think we'd have to take a few steps back. And I want to talk a little bit about how we went from being an organization representing people on death row representing children who have been sentenced to die in prison, working in these prison condition cases, how we went from being an organization focused on that to one that's now opened up a memorial dedicated to memorializing over 4,000 African-American men, women, and children who were lynched from the end of Reconstruction, 1877, to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Because for us, the legacy of lynching is apparent every day in the work that we do. I think few institutions and spaces like the criminal justice system, or few institutions in America really expose the legacy of our nation's history of racial and economic injustice, our history of lynching like our criminal justice system. It is impossible to do indigent defense work in the rural South, in the American South, and not to encounter the legacies of this kind of deeply entrenched history of slavery, native genocide, lynching, and racial apartheid. And it became clear to us a couple of years ago that we needed to change the narrative environment within which our cases are being heard to actually move our work forward. And so it was a really organic outgrowth of our legal work. And to give you a little bit of background there, we were founded about 30 years ago last year, in 1989. And EJI was founded in response to a civil rights crisis in our state. At the time of our founding, 25% of all executions in this country were coming out of the state of Alabama. We had one of the highest execution rates in the nation. And what makes that statistic so problematic is the fact that we did not have then in 1989, we still don't have today in 2020, a statewide, state-funded public defender system. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the people ending up on Alabama's death row weren't there because they're committing the worst crimes in the state, but because they didn't have access to proper, adequate legal representation. We're seeing poor people, people of color, disproportionately represented on Alabama's death row. We had folks who were quite literally dying for legal representation. So EJI was founded to fill this vacuum, fill this void. We've expanded our mandate over the last 30 years, worked in several other project areas. We do a lot of work with children in the criminal justice system, representing children who have been sentenced to die in prison, representing children who have been incarcerated in adult facilities, and also working with these children once we've been able to find relief in their reentry programs, or the reentry, because there are no services that we provide to folks who are coming back into society, even though the majority of the people that are incarcerated today will come back into society at some point. And then the third kind of legal project area that we work on is around prison conditions, challenging abusive conditions of confinement in American jails and prisons. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. This country has about 5% of our total, the United States has 5% of the world's total population, yet we incarcerate 25% of the world's prison population. And African Americans comprise of a disproportionate majority in this system. And so we do a lot of work around these prison conditions because our prisons are overcrowded, underfunded, understaffed, and they create these environments that are defined by a lot of neglect, a lot of abuse, and a lot of violence. But about 10 years ago, we realized that we couldn't fully advocate for our clients, whether it's the men and women that we represent on Alabama's death row, whether it's the children that we advocate for, or the prison condition cases that we're involved in. We couldn't fully advocate for our clients without talking about how and why race and class seem to be playing such a central role in the cases of our clients, seem to be determining outcomes. We have a criminal justice system today that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and you're innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes, and we know that racial bias in particular is also shaping and determining outcomes. And the question then becomes why and how. How did we get to this system where we have over 2.3 million people incarcerated in our jails and prisons, 8 million people on probation, on parole, about 10 million people cycling in and out of our jails annually? We came to realize that we needed to talk more honestly about our history, particularly these eras of American history in this country that were defined and shaped by racial injustice. And for us, this story actually begins with Native genocide. We believe that this country is a post-genocide society. Then when white European settlers arrived on this continent, there were already millions of people on these lands, and it was a genocide that was committed. We drove them from their lands through famine, war, disease. We took these lands, and that genocide, even before a constitution was written in this country, was justified using a narrative of racial difference. It was justified by saying, well, these native people, they are different from us. They are savages. And that narrative of racial difference is what allowed for over 2 centuries of chattel slavery to emerge in this country. And that's what we identify as one of the great evils of American slavery. And that's not to dismiss or discount the violence and the brutality of that institution, but we really do believe one of the great evils of American slavery was this narrative that was developed, this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority that was developed to justify the buying and selling of human flesh in a country that had been founded on the principle quote that all men are created equal. Because you see, people didn't just want to own black people in this country, they wanted to own black people and feel Christian about it too. So they had to tell themselves stories about this group of enslaved Africans to justify the buying and selling of human flesh. You had to say, well, these group of enslaved Africans, they are not human like we are. They can't do this, they can't do that. In fact, the United States Supreme Court actually ruled that African Americans were 3/5 of a human being. And this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy and black inferiority actually survives the abolition of slavery. You know, when you read the 13th Amendment, which abolishes involuntary servitude and forced labor, except as a punishment for crime, and we can come back to that exception in just a second, that clause says nothing about this narrative of racial difference, this ideology of white supremacy. You read the Emancipation Proclamation issued a few years earlier. Again, it says nothing about dismantling, deconstructing this ideology, this narrative, which is why we've made the argument at EJI that slavery doesn't actually end in 1865. It just evolves. It turns into what, for African Americans in this country, was defined, an era that was defined by racial terrorism, which manifested itself most dramatically in what we call these racial terror lynchings. We actually spent a lot of time researching this time period between the end of Reconstruction, 1877, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. It's a very critical time period in American history. You have a society transitioning from a slavocracy to a multiracial functioning democracy. And I know when I was studying American history in school, we'd always seem to jump over the Reconstruction period. We'd never really talk about it. If we talk about the Civil War, it's usually inaccurately, and then we'll jump right to the Civil Rights Movement. There's no real engagement with this critical time period where you have an entire group of people moving into franchise, into citizenship. And what we see is that because of this failure to really reckon with these narratives, the system just takes on a new form. We see conflict leasing emerge in these states of the South. They start rewriting their state constitutions. They initiate or they put together what historians have called these black codes. And we actually see a kind of the first iteration of mass incarceration at the time. But we also have documented during this time period this extremely, this high rate of lynchings. We've documented over 4,000 lynchings of African-American men, women, and children who were pulled out of their homes, pulled out of churches, pulled out of courtrooms, and they were lynched. And lynchings for us aren't just folks who were hanged, folks who were burned alive, shot, drowned, and brutalized in these ways. And we use the language of terror because we think that is what it was. The purpose of these lynchings was to instill fear and maintain social control, maintain racial hierarchy. And the folks who were lynched weren't just folks who were accused of committing some kind of criminal activity. We've also documented what we call these lynchings based off of social transgressions. I'm thinking about the lynching of an elderly black woman in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1940s, Elizabeth Lawrence. She was walking home, and a group of white children started throwing rocks at her, and she stopped and did what I think anybody would do, which is to tell them, it's not polite to throw rocks at people. But word got around town that this elderly white woman was telling these white children what to do, and so their parents, they formed a mob. They came to her home, they pulled her out, they lynched her, and then when her son came back to try and find justice for her mother, the mob reformed, they wanted to lynch him, they ended up burning down his home, and he flees to Boston. And there's a lot in that story. It speaks to how the very demographic geography of this country today has been shaped by that history. I'm referring here to the Great Migration, this mass exodus of African Americans from the American South to the North and West. About 6 million African Americans fled the South during the 20th century. And the way that we were usually taught about, or at least the way I was taught about the Great Migration in school, is often taught in economic terms, that people were looking for economic opportunity that was denied in the Jim and Jane Crow South. And that's not the full story. What we've found in our research was that this was a forced exodus, that the black people that arrived in places like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Boston didn't arrive there as immigrants looking for new economic opportunity. They arrived there as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And there also has to be a conversation about what was the response in some of these northern cities to this influx of African Americans. You know, last year was the centennial of the Red Summer of 1919, when a wave of racial violence sweeps across these urban centers in the north. That was, again, in response to this great migration. But the thing that I want to definitely highlight, I know I might be running out of time here, is the ways in which this era of racial terrorism has impacted our criminal justice system. Our research has shown that the states that have the highest lynching rates are the states that have the highest death penalty rates today. And we know from our research that this actually isn't an accident. You can and Professor Brundage writes about this in his book on Virginia and Georgia. You know, when these mobs would come to county jails to abduct somebody and lynch them, sometimes the governor, the sheriff would stop the mob and say, don't lynch this man, because tomorrow there'll be a trial, there'll be an all-white judge, or all-white jury, white judge, white prosecutor, we're gonna find them guilty and we're gonna hang them. And so we've seen in our research how these lynchings move from outside of the courtroom, in some cases quite literally, into inside the courtroom. And this was because there was a lot of pressure on the Southern community in the 1940s and 1950s. That was some of the business community. It didn't look good for us to be moralizing about the evils of the Nazi regime when there were pictures like the ones that you saw in the international media of these mobs in the South brutalizing black bodies in the public square. And so we see this violence move indoors. And again, in the work that we were doing representing these folks, as we started looking into the history of the communities where we were doing our work, it became very clear that we needed to talk about this history. And so over the last 10 years at EJI, we have a number of projects that are designed to get people closer to this history, to get them to make these connections. And I have a few images here. I don't know how much time I have left, maybe a minute or two. And I did want to show you all the kind of path that we take at the memorial. And so the first thing that you see when you come into the memorial is this sculpture by Kwame Bamfo-Akoto, this Ghanaian, incredible Ghanaian artist that depicts the brutality of enslavement and the humanity of the enslaved. And it was really important for us to start with this sculpture about slavery, because you can't understand lynching if you don't understand this history of enslavement. And the other thing, you can't see it on this side, but to the other side of the sculptures, we actually have what we call a narrative wall. And the reason that's really important, or a really important part of our design, is that in this country we haven't really talked honestly about this era, and so there isn't a real consciousness about what happened during this time. If you go to Berlin, to Brandenburg Square, and you visit the Holocaust Memorial there, it's a very abstract experience. You have these blocks because they trust that people can come into that space with a narrative about the Holocaust that will allow them to have a profound experience. Whereas you can't really do that in this country. It's certainly not in Montgomery, a city which, you know, before we put up these markers and memorials, there was nothing there that spoke to this history. And I'll show these last few pictures and then I'll wrap it up. We have Hank Willis Thomas is another one of the artists that we collaborated with. This raised up sculpture is what you see after you've gone through most of the memorial, and it's evokes our kind of contemporary movements against police violence. And then we have, about 800 suspended monuments that represent the 800 counties where we've documented over 4,000 lynchings. Each of these counties have the name of the county and the names of the individuals that we've been able to uncover, the dates of their lynching. And then this is Memorial Square. And what we wanted to do here was invert the experience of the public spectacle lynchings, when you had thousands of people that would gather to participate in these ritualistic festival-like acts of violence. And here, when you get to the top of Memorial Square, that experience is inverted. You're almost standing with these monuments in judgment of the one person that's there. And so we wanted to do something visual there. And then here you can see what we have, the water wall. The water wall is dedicated to the unknown victims. We always say it's 4,000 documented. There's so many victims that we don't have documentation confirming that those lynchings occurred, but we know that many did, and so we have a wall that's dedicated to the unknown. victims, and this is a quote from our executive director, Brian Stevenson. And then in Memorial Park, or Monument Park, we have duplicates of these monuments that are lying down. And what we did when we opened up the memorial was ask the counties where we documented these lynchings to claim their monuments, bring them back to their communities, and start a local process of truth and repair, truth and reconciliation. And so that's an active project. I work on our community remembrance projects where we're putting up historical markers and doing soil collections at sites where we've documented lynchings. And I can probably talk a little bit more about that later on because I think I've run out of time. But yeah, last thing I have to say is to invite each and every person in this room to come down to Montgomery, Alabama, and to visit us at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration.
How is everybody? Okay? It's a lot of information. All right. So I'm a visual artist, and I'm actually a professor of art, not of history, so be understanding. So I'm sharing my work with you since it fits in to the exhibition upstairs. And of course, I want to thank everybody for being here and the organizers for inviting me. I thought I'd begin with a billboard I did for in Nashville in the weeks leading up to the 2018 midterm elections. It was part of the For Freedom's 50 States Initiative, which was a national effort to get out the vote through art, founded and run by artist Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottsman, and so you can see it there. My billboard included an image of a lynch mob from California in 1935, to which I added a quote from President Barack Obama, in which he warned that, quote, democracies can fail, close quote. At the time, I had never imagined that democracy could fail in America, but now I'm beginning to wonder, right? As we now know, over 4,000 African Americans have been lynched in the US, and I wish to acknowledge that no artwork can address the ongoing pain and trauma of lynching to African Americans and their families. But my project was begun in solidarity with a wave of new scholarship on lynching in the early 2000s. The research started as a response to real-life vigilantes who had begun to appear along the US-Mexican border with groups like the Minuteman Project that embraced the waves of anti-Mexican, anti-immigration rhetoric that was being promoted by then President George W. Bush, and which in 2005 led to Operation Steamline, which made the unauthorized crossing of the border a crime. Sadly, many such vigilante groups continue to exist along the border today. Here are just two images. Texas Rangers patrolling the US-Mexico border in 1915 on the left, and an image of vigilantes in New Mexico in 2019 by AP photographer Paul Rache on the right. It's last year, last April. So where to begin? Here's an image of downtown Los Angeles in the 1860s, showing the lynching of 5 men, 3 Anglos, and 2 Latinos, who became the starting point for my own research into lynching in California. This is an installation shot from Unseen, Our Past in a New Light, which was the title of a 2-person exhibition of my work with Titus Kaffar that sought to raise awareness of Black and Brown histories at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. in 2018. I included works from the Erased Lynching series to show that the characterization of Latinx communities as criminals, rapists, and drug dealers coming out of D.C. isn't just political rhetoric. It puts people at risk, and as we saw in the Walmart shooting in El Paso, in the separation of families along the US-Mexico border, in the increase in white nationalism, and the ongoing expansion of private detention centers across the nation, not to mention Trump's wall, that Latinos are being targeted. As an LA-based artist and photographer, I set out to look for some of the lynching sites I'd uncovered in researching my book. This is just one of them, a project that resulted in the publication of Lynching in the West, 1850 to 1935, which is upstairs in the gallery on the shelves and 3 photographic bodies of work, Searching for California Hang Trees, which you see one example, Memento Mori, in which I basically photographed young Latino men of the same age and state, and then had them presented with the trees. And I began my book before Without Sanctuary came out, but obviously it changed everything. In the end, I documented over 350 cases of lynching for the state of California and brought new attention to the lynching of Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, Filipinos, Jews, and whites, and recorded for the first time that Latinos made up 44% of those cases in California, in spite of Latinos being less than 5% of the population, around 1900. Since then, over 500 cases documenting the lynching of Latinos and Latinas have been identified by scholars nationwide. When I began the series, I wanted to make a project about whiteness and racial injustice, but I didn't want to re-victimize those who'd been killed. To erase something can be seen as a form of displacement or destruction, but in my work, I've tried to turn erasure into a site of production and absence into an effective presence that critically engages viewers and creates new meaning. By erasing the bodies and the ropes in each image, I hoped viewers might begin to see similarities between lynch mobs across the nation and across time. We've already seen images of this case earlier. The project had to include African Americans, and I should add that nearly all the images were created from real postcards or copy prints, meaning that I had to collect them and in order to make the artworks, which has taken me over nearly 20 years so far. When I started the project, I was trying to understand how and why Latinx bodies had been erased from the history of lynching, not only in California, but nationwide. Since then, I see absence as a presence that allows us, the viewer, to see whiteness in photography in a whole new way. That is, it gives us permission to see the crowd. In this image, we see US soldiers in uniform after they've killed a Mexican along the border a full century ago. I also felt that this image might tie in nicely with the discussion of John Wilson's The Incident, which is about a black man painting about lynching in Mexico, and of course, I'm a Latino man making work about lynching in the US. As in all the works, I've erased the body and the rope from the center of the image, but have left the soldiers, and you can clearly make out their smiling and grinning faces, the ghostly pantomime of the men's hands curled around a missing rope, and the now familiar characterization of Latinx victims as bandits, as criminals, reflected in the original text still along the bottom of the postcard. And perhaps most importantly, we see all the eyes turned to the camera, eyes that anticipated a knowing grin in a viewer we cannot see, but we can certainly imagine. In Camera Lucida, Roland Barthes writes, "Affect was what I didn't want to reduce. I wanted to explore it not as a question, but as a wound. I see, I feel, hence I notice, I observe, and I think," close quote. For me, the absence of the Latinx experience from our national narrative is a wound that won't heal. Latinx bodies continue to be vilified, misidentified, unrecognized, unseen, and unheard. Absence and erasure became 2 effective strategies that I employed to invite viewers to consider not just what was missing, but what we share, that which wounds us all. Absence is a presence in the work, and I would add to Barthes' rather slow-paced reaction that a wound can also awaken us and bring us to our feet. Here is an image of all 60 postcards from the series, many of which have never been seen or exhibited or published. The American novelist Toni Morrison seemed to have understood our own historical moment when she wrote, quote, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art," close quote. So in closing, I'd just like to add that my work borrows from restorative justice practices where punishment is replaced with reconciliation to promote and engage public discourse as a part of a critical practice to encourage solidarity, empathy, and compassion, and that as artists, scholars, and activists, we must engage critically and creatively, and constantly remind ourselves that, like the protagonist in Wilson's The Incident, sometimes we have to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Thank you.
Well, wow, thank you, all of you, not just for mostly staying on time, but for being brilliant. I'm going to ask one question and see how our panel handles it, and then we're going to open it up to you. So get ready. Do we have microphones out there? We do? Or we do, okay, good. I think Ken challenged us with the question. By how explicitly at the end of your talk, Ken, you portrayed your work as an attempt to bring solidarity with the victims, their families, to bring empathy to this story, to bring compassion, to bring healing, and I could go on with those labels. I'm wondering, as historians, Fitz, Crystal, and Jonathan, as now part of this extraordinary new museum, memorial, which exhibits this history, how do each of you think about your own work? Do you think about it the way Ken does? Do you write on this subject to heal us? Or expose this? Or for solidarity with victims? I mean, where do you fit in the way you see how you do your work about this subject in relation to what Ken just expressed? Historians first.
Let's go first. Well, and it may be appropriate in a way for me to go first in the sense that I'll just tell an anecdote. When I started work on my dissertation, it was by happenstance. I didn't go to graduate school intending to study lynching. It had never entered my mind. I've read a book called The Mind of the South by W.J. Cash. I read it previously, but I read it, and it's a book I love to read, to argue with it. It's a deeply offensive book to me in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to tangle with that book, and so I thought, I'll write a seminar paper on lynching. And let me tell you, if you tried to do research on the subject of lynching in the United States in the 1980s, it was a lonely world out there. There was really only one other scholar I met who had a fellowship at Harvard when I was a graduate student there, named George Wright, who is certainly a pioneer of the study of lynching.
He wrote on Kentucky, didn't he?
Yeah. And that was it. I'll just tell you, the first 3 times I submitted professional papers for conferences, I knew no one else in the United States working on the subject of lynching at that time. So I mention this simply to say that that was a landscape in which the scholarship that I had to look to had either dealt with lynching in passing or had been written in the 1930s in an effort to combat lynching. And let me actually bring this home to Yale. I always like to do this with this particular scholar. The scholar C. Van Woodward wrote at great length about railroads in the New South. He wrote at great length about economic change in the South. You can total the number of pages that he wrote that addressed the subject of lynching, and they wouldn't even make a decent-sized seminar paper. So the most noted Civil War historian of most of the 20th century did not write on the subject of lynching at any great length, nor did he train any graduate students that addressed the subject. So this was a subject that was essentially outside of the field of American history. Sociologists looked at it, but it was outside the field of American history really until the 1980s, and then especially from the 90s on. So when active recovery, I don't want to say that I had any great mission, and I don't want to elevate myself that way, but I was curious about this grotesque phenomenon and the silence about it. And I didn't have, now I can look back about it and I could read higher motivations into it, but it was this curious silence that I could not understand when I first encountered it. And then, not to keep picking on C. Van Woodward, but to think that the most renowned scholar in American history in the 20th century working on this field was virtually silent on the subject.
Thanks.
Hello? Okay. Just to pick up where you left off, talking about this silence, I think what's become clear to us in the work that we're doing at the Equal Justice Initiative is that the silence around the history of racial and economic injustice in this country, the silence around the history of lynching, has compromised our ability today to create a society where equal justice is a reality for everyone. And so we are interested in bringing this history up. We are interested in moving our country closer, moving this country closer to freedom, moving this country closer to liberation. We really do believe that there is a restorative power to truth-telling. And truth and reconciliation for us is a sequential thing. It's, you can't get to reconciliation, repair, restoration, all of these wonderful R words without doing the difficult work of telling the truth first. And so we see it as a kind of form of advocacy. And to talk about it in more personal terms, I think, as you all heard, I was born just a few months before the 1994 genocide against Tutsis erupted in Rwanda. And I was born to both sides of the ethnic divide. My father was Hutu, my mother was Tutsi. And what that meant was that my mother's name was put on the extermination list. We were lucky to escape and survive, but unfortunately most of my mother's family was killed in the genocide. I grew up as a refugee before returning back to Rwanda. But I had in returning to Rwanda, today Rwanda is completely unrecognizable from where we were 25 years ago. We've made these remarkable strides. We have the most women in politics of any country in the world. We've cut infant mortality in half. Our GDP has been growing at a rate of 10% over the last decade or so. And when you ask Rwandans, how is it that we've been able to make this kind of progress in this impossibly short period of time, what you're going to hear is a variation on a theme. You're going to hear about how we committed ourselves as a society to a process of truth and repair, truth and reconciliation. We didn't say that our history is too controversial, that it's something we need to sweep under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. Instead, we committed ourselves to this process of truth-telling. We've marked the killing sites. We've set up museums and memorials that are dedicated to these victims. We dedicate the entire month of April every single year to remembering and committing to never again. And when I came to the United States, I came to the Deep South. I was in South Carolina. It became very clear to me when I got here just the absence, the silence around this history and how that has shaped the conversations or the discourses that we have around race. And so this work that we're doing around elevating this history, trying to create this consciousness about lynching is so that we can really effectively deal with its legacy today, because we believe at Ijad that there is something better for us than what we're experiencing today. That this system of mass incarceration, excessive punishment, and the kind of abuse that exists in that space, and not just there, and we can talk about healthcare, we can talk about housing, we can talk about education. We believe that in talking about these things, will move us closer to the kind of repair that we need to see happen. And so that's, I think, kind of how we come to this work, or think about this work.
Jonathan, do you mind if I just interject one question about your story? You went to Furman.
That's right.
Your alma mater is now pretty famous for facing the past of its founder, its namesake, being a slaveholder and then some. When you think about that, do you smile or are you proud? I mean, given the experience you've had in America, an institution that manages finally to wring its hands and face a part of its past is a big news story, whereas what your country experienced, is far more violent. Anyway,
So
How do you think about that?
And what's funny, I haven't told Professor Blight this yet, but you actually were at Furman a few years ago, and you gave a lecture. You might not even I was studying a class on public memory and racial violence in the United States, and we read Race in Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory, and so you came in, and that was a really interesting lecture at the time for us. You know, I was in college when the Charleston Massacre happened, and there was a lot of organizing that I was involved in on campus and around the state to bring down the Confederate flag from the state capitol. And so there was a lot of conversations when I was there around this history. And around that time, we also started talking about Furman, the namesake, who was not just a slave owner, he was one of the most prominent Baptist preachers in the American South at that time, and he wrote a very famous and infamous kind of apology or defense of slavery from a theological perspective or a Christian perspective, using the Bible to justify this institution. And so over the last couple of years, I was actually part of the committee at Furman that we developed this report talking about this.
I didn't know that when I asked you this. So
yeah, and you know, I think it's an important step, but it's a very, very small step. You know, I want to move people away from kind of patting themselves on the back for, you know, acknowledging that these things happen. But you know, for me, I've been mostly challenged by the fact that even though we might be talking a little bit better about the history, I don't know if we've been as responsive to some of the actual things that students of color and faculty of color have been organizing around and been challenged by on campus. And so I think it's an important first step to start talking honestly about that history. But that's all that it is. It's a first step. We have to, you know, maintain a kind of ongoing commitment to truth telling. And so so I was excited, but not too excited.
Thank you.
David, thanks for the question. And you know, of course, as a Black feminist, as someone who considers herself a women's historian, of course, I think the past matters, and that my work, I often, you know, think, you know, it came out of a moment, I'm about to age myself, in 1992, after the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, you know, when Clarence Thomas, you know, described the hearings as a high-tech lynching, and how that narrative basically erased Anita Hill's experience. And that Black feminists and white feminists struggled to really reckon with Anita Hill's experience and to try to come together in solidarity to make an argument on her behalf, and they really struggled. And I've thought, you know, why is it that the history of rape and the lynching of Black women is not remembered, right? And why does this particular narrative of a Black man being lynched trump her experience of sexual harassment? And so I thought I need to go back. She doesn't have a narrative that she can mobilize, right? And the way that you talk about the EJI, say that we have to create these narratives and commit them to doing work in the present, right? That we have to record them and write them. So for me, I can think, yes, I'm committed, and I felt like my work was about exposing something that hadn't been exposed fully, that it was about solidarity and trying to get Black and white feminists to see where their interests intersected. And then, in many ways, I often, as I tell my students, when I'm teaching my classes and the way that I think about my work, it's always a call to action, right? The question of healing is a much harder one. I don't know if I've ever thought of my work in that category, and I imagine it's something that I could bring to bear. I mean, I think when I teach critical race theory, I'm trying to get students to sort of think across racial and class and gender differences in a way that allows them to move forward together. Is that healing? I don't know, but it's necessary if we're going to move forward together, that they have to talk to each other and they have to recognize each other and see that this isn't, I have to often say to them, this isn't an oppression Olympics, right? It's not either or, that these things are all happening at the same time, and that if we can see the connections, that the absences and the erasure actually serve to keep us divided if we can't actually see the connections. And maybe that allows us to heal, but I don't know.
Yeah, I suspect if us as writers and scholars expected our work to heal the world in some time frame, we'd be a pretty depressed lot, I suspect. On the other hand, it may be part of what we want to do, whether we say it or not. It's a hard thing. How is it different for a visual artist? How do you think about this as a visual artist? I think you're on.
Yeah, I think I just explained it. but I'll revisit it in a slower format, I guess.
Yeah.
I think as
Informal.
I think as an artist, the goal is to make a thing, and then ultimately, you want someone to look at it. So I can make things in my studio all day long, but it's when they're shown that suddenly it becomes transformed. And so, like the Smithsonian, I don't have an institute to work with, or there isn't a Latino museum in this country. We're not recognized yet. There will be a small one, apparently. But that's been a struggle. Oh, that's a whole other talk. Anyway, so putting these in the Smithsonian was, for me, so the National Portrait Gallery doesn't have any Latinos in it, or very few. They've been adding some. So putting all the missing Latinos in the museum, in our National Portrait Gallery, getting to do that was, for me, a strategy, a politics, a part of the art making, and transform the work from being just on my computer or something I'm interested in to something that did impact people. A lot of people, most Americans don't know or care that deeply about the lynching of Latinos or the experience of Latinos. Along the border, the incarcerated families, 50,000, whatever that is. It's hard for us to visualize that and to think of what to do about it. We know we don't like it. So anyway, so for me, the exhibition is a moment where meaning happens. That changes every time, every exhibition. When that work is shown in different communities, it's going to be seen differently, and other people are going to bring different history to it. If you take away the label, then so it's a placeholder. But for me, really, the artwork is where I have to make stuff, and that's where I feel some redemption in the world or something. I don't know. I find it meaningful to make work.
We're envious.
Well, it doesn't always make me feel good. In fact, it rarely does.
I'm going to bend things just slightly, and I want to use this as an opportunity, since I have someone here to do it to directly, to just express my appreciation for what EJI is doing, in particular in bringing the history of lynching home to specific places. That it's not just something that happened there, it happened here, and that's really important. I just have a brief anecdote to tell you, which I think it gets back to the point about the silences. When I was doing my dissertation, I drove around to about 30 courthouses in southwestern and south central Georgia looking for coroner's reports, because coroner's reports were one way I thought I could find lynchings that might not have made it into newspapers. But you wouldn't be surprised that in many southern states there was no law to retain coroner's reports. It wasn't just happenstance, probably. But there was also the problem that many coroners, as I can attest, were barely literate. So even if you do find their coroner's reports, I don't know what language they were writing in, but it wasn't English. But I digress. So I went into one county, Mitchell County, if any of you are familiar with Georgia, where Camilla, Georgia is. And I went in and asked the county clerk, where do they keep coroner's reports? And she looked at me like I was insane. No one had ever asked to see them. Said, I have no clue. She took me down to the basement. We spent over an hour rooting around in boxes, and lo and behold, we found 5 coroner's reports, including one of 2 African-American men who were murdered. Without question, they were lynched, and it never made it into the newspapers, and the coroners got testimony from the people who did the lynching, and nothing ever happened. Anyways, needless to say, when I found that as a historian, I was like, whoa, gold mine here. But I didn't want to tell her because I had no idea what this white county clerk, how she would respond to this. So we went upstairs. I also should add I needed her help to photocopy them. So I went upstairs, and she helped me photocopy these, and she said, "Why do you want these?" And I said, "Well, I'm researching murders." "Well, why these murders?" And I said, "Well, they're actually lynchings." She said, "Lynchings in Mitchell County?" I was like, "Well, yeah, there were actually 5 in this county. It had some of the most lynchings of any single county in Georgia." She was fascinated. She asked all these other women clerks and secretaries, so 5 white women gathered around this photocopy machine and wanted to hear me tell them everything I knew about these 5 lynchings. And then they said to me, "If we can do anything to help you, just write us, let us know." And here I was with my Massachusetts license plate parked away so that nobody in the courthouse could see it. I'd assumed that their response would be, "Okay, clamp down on this. This is not a memory we want people to know about." But instead, their ignorance was simply, and I can't read too much into it because I don't know it, but it was simply of not knowing anything about this history of violence in their county. And I think that's where what the EJI is doing is it's bringing that history home so that I don't know whether Mitchell County has done anything yet. I would be surprised if they have, but someday they may. And then those people in the courthouse will know that history.
Wow. Let's open this up to questions, otherwise we will run out of time. Who's got the mics? I don't know where the mics are. Here we are, right down here in the middle row. We got 3 hands up, I think. Either side, however you want to. Right here.
Timing.
Yes, ma'am.
So let me just preface this by saying that I'm originally from Tuskegee, Alabama, which, as I understand, was at one point called Lynch County, Alabama, before Tuskegee University was founded there. So a couple of questions for the gentleman from EJI. One is whether or not Alabama's electric chair is still sunshine yellow and called Yellow Mama. And the other is I've wondered, as I hear about offering the counties the opportunity to come and claim their memorials of who was lynched in their county, what kind of response have you gotten? I also just want to comment that I appreciate that you're talking about lynchings in California and all across the country, because there's a tendency to think that this just happened in the Deep South and not all across the country.
Well, thank you for that question. We relied very heavily on the work of Professor Monroe Work from Tuskegee, was a professor there who did a lot of research in documenting the lynchings at that time. But your question about, I'll start with your second question because that's the one I immediately remember right now, about the Community Remembrance Project. So as I mentioned, we have 800, we've documented over 4,000 lynchings in about 800 counties across this country, over 20 states. And when we opened the memorial, we had no idea whether people would respond to this call of action. In fact, we were kind of worried that maybe nobody would. But we've been really excited that over 300 counties across the U.S. have reached out and expressed interest in claiming their monuments. But one thing that we realized, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, one thing that we realized afterwards was that we weren't interested in creating a dynamic where people would just, show up and say, "Let me just pick up my monument, put it in my county, and racism is over in X county," or whatever. We were more interested in communities really committing to an ongoing process of truth and repair. We didn't want these things to be just some kind of symbol or something. We really wanted it to be a lens through which communities look at contemporary issues and represents a commitment to never again. And so what we've been doing is working with communities to start with our historical marker project, which we actually think has more narrative power than the monument. The monuments just have the names in the county, and hopefully we'll have some sort of inscription around there. But that's all that is. You might, if you don't know about what the monument is, you might think that these are World War II veterans or something like that. Well, the markers, on the other hand, have the actual narrative about the victims in that county. It might be, some of our markers are about like an individual lynching, sometimes they're about multiple lynchings or some of these massacres. And on the second side of the back side of the marker, we have this more historical, general kind of historical context about that era of racial terrorism. And we also have these, we usually do these, my favorite parts of this, we have these high school essay competitions that we do alongside the marker installations. We have these ceremonies, and there's an essay competition for high school students in the public school system where we ask them to write about an historical incident in their community or across the country. We have one of our resources that we provide. We put out this, shameless plug, we put out this calendar every year called the History of Racial Injustice Calendar. Every single day has an incident of racial injustice, that most of which you might not find in textbooks. And so we usually ask them to write about one of these incidents and connect it to something that they see in their own lives. And usually we'll have the winners of that essay read their essay. And it's so powerful to hear young people talk about this history and make these kinds of connections to what they have going on. And we found that these marker ceremonies have been really powerful events for communities to really be able to expose that history, excavate it, and commit to never again. And we've seen a lot of incredible organizing emerge out of the coalitions that have developed around our community remembrance project. And the other facet of it is our soil collections. I wasn't able to speak as much earlier, but we have this project where we're going to the sites where we've documented lynchings. We were asking community members to collect soil, put them in these jars that have the name of the victim, the county in which they were lynched, the date of their lynching, as a kind of visual witness to what happened. And in many cases, that might be all that we have left of that history, is just the soil where that act of violence occurred. But we wanted to give community members, again, an opportunity to do something tangible to remember. And that's been something that we've been really, really excited about. I forget, what was your first question? Oh, the Sunshine Chair.
I asked you about Yellow Mama.
Yes.
And that sort of celebration of execution.
Yeah, so with regards to methods of execution right now in the state of Alabama, from what I know, I think over the last couple of years, it's mostly been by injection now. There's this kind of cocktail of drugs that they use. I don't know if we've had any electrocutions in the last couple of years, but I can find out, and afterwards I can send you an email about it.
There were other questions in the middle here. Yes, ma'am. And I see 2 rows in front. Yes.
As I listened to someone state that the majority of the lynchings were to black men, it just made me wonder something that I want to throw out to all of you to comment on. Are today's police shootings modern-day lynchings?
Fitz, you picked up the mic. Go ahead.
Well, we were going to sit here in embarrassed silence, or if not embarrassed, we were going to sit here trying to figure out how to answer that. I'll just offer one observation. I think yes and no. And let me start with the no. I think no in the sense that most often police shootings do not directly invoke the entire community the way lynchings often did. And so, in a sense, it makes the problem worse because we can say the policeman did it. Somehow I'm not complicit in that act the way if you witnessed a lynching, you were complicit in the act. So I think there's important, if you will, social, ritualistic, community aspect of police brutality that's missing. However, the other side that I think is very similar is that we know that police, or I should say law officers, were deeply implicated in a very substantial proportion of lynchings. I think in the South, of which I know more about, but I can't speak elsewhere in the West, I'll leave it to others, but at least in the South, probably 2/3 of lynchings involve some sort of complicity of the police, varying from sort of tacit acceptance to outright complete participation. So in that regard, the continuity of officers of law engaging in extra legal violence, and I realize some could say that a police shooting might not be extra legal, but on the other hand, when we see social media of people being shot in their automobiles while they're sitting there and their seatbelts on, or they're running away from the policeman. That would seem to me to have crossed over into a form of extra-legal violence. So that's why I would say yes and no.
I would add yes and no as well. But I would also add the kind of, you know, on the one hand, we can say, oh, that it's an individual police officer, that we, you know, it's a bad apple or whatnot. But we also know that, you know, we tend not to indict, that there is a kind of culture that allows for excessive force that is used against particularly Black people, brown people, poor people, homeless people, gay people, that, you know, in this way that we are often complicit, right? But we are more apt to say, well, that's a bad apple. And, but that there is a way that we have given police officers the right to engage in what is considered reasonable violence, right? And there's a really good book by a legal scholar. Her last name is Seo, S-E-O, and it looks at policing and automobiles. It just came out last year. And she doesn't draw a link between lynching and policing and police brutality, but when I read it, for me, I could see some of those connections, particularly in the way that how we think about extra-legal violence, and that some communities are allowed to engage in mob violence, you know, if it's an act of chivalry, if the courts are too slow, and all of these things that are similar to the way that people begin to justify police violence, so that we have images of Black men as brutes and monsters, and fear that if you think you're going to be attacked or killed, that police officers can then engage in violence. And we accept, I mean, not me, but lots of people accept that as acceptable, right? So I think yes and no.
Next question right here. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for an extraordinary event here. Initially, my question was, the first question asked was how many communities have come, Jonathan, to ask for their stones. But I had two other questions since you answered that one so well. I want to address Ken. As I was looking at your work about erasure, it struck me that some of the work I'm doing on rape narratives could use your brilliant technique of taking the spectacle of the sexualized victim's body out so that you see it's a transaction between groups of men, and the woman is caught between them. And what you've done is so brilliant, and it seems so obvious now that you've done it, which is how so many inspired works are, that now that you don't have the sexualized violence of the tortured Black body there, you see the groups of white men and the looks on their faces and the crowd. That's an amazing insight, and thank you, because I can use it as well in my own work. It opens so many doors of perception. My other question is actually a statement and a question. As I was listening, I realized that having worked on lynching and Russian Jewish history, I would say to Americans, we do have a parallel to the pogroms, and that's lynching, lynch mobs in America. Like pogroms, they had a false narrative of the blood libel, you know, the sacrifice of the child, to use the blood to make matzahs at Passover, and this, again, as I think it was, I can't remember which of you said it first, that not only did they want to own Black people, they wanted to feel really Christian about it, right? This whole idea of Christian violence, it's an underpinning of a lot of what we're talking about here. The tendency of a religion based on a sacrifice to then sacrifice others. So, it's only partly a question.
Any comment?
I don't think that was a question, right?
Yeah.
So,
it was a tribute to you.
Yeah,
thank
but
you.
I guess the question is just, do you...
I mean, I would just, maybe one little thing, just to say that when I present this work at different places, now that it's relative, once you've seen it or heard of it, it sort of makes sense, and then you can imagine it. But doing it the first time was really hard to do, and getting people to show it was really hard to do. And so it's been a very difficult to find places that want to talk about Latino history at all, really. I mean, I guess that'd be the short thing I would say. And so, Yeah. So it's an ongoing struggle in that sense.
And I don't know who you are, but I would love to talk to you at some point, because when you said, you know, taking the women out sort of reveals that there's a transaction between men. And I would challenge you in that kind of framing, and part of what I do in my work and trying to center women is to say this isn't just about transactions between men. That most people, even when they're writing about black men as victims, they see it as a transaction between black and white men about masculinity and protection of white womanhood. And one of the things I do as a historian is to argue that, well, in this moment where black men are becoming victims of racial and sexual violence at the hands of white men, that in fact women are moving into public spaces in new ways, making demands for suffrage and a whole host of rights, right? And that the lynching of black men for the alleged rape of white women is about keeping women at home and afraid, keeping them under this umbrella of protection, which is not just about men negotiating, their relationships and in relationship to one another. But it is about the kind of power politics between men and women that are very much at play. And so that when, even if we're talking about warfare, that when men rape during war, it's not just about, this conflict between men. Booty and the rewards of, making sure that these other men feel defeated, but that women are part of the battlefront, right? That it is a weapon of war in which women are actual actors, and that if we can't understand that gender dynamic, then we get these narratives where women are erased, are absent, are put to the margins.
I don't think we disagree at all.
And by the way, on the Christian imagery, just for the sake of discussion, it's interesting how the cross is, of course, a double-edged or a dual image. If you ever get a chance to see Jacob Lawrence's work, and especially his famous series on John Brown, which I had a chance to actually see in a gallery by itself once and had to give a talk about it. And 18 of the 20 panels in that series have a cross, twisted cross. And I was stupid enough to ask him, like I just asked, you don't ask an artist why they do what they do. And I did ask him, why do you have so many crosses in this series? And he asked me what kind of wildlife we had around Amherst, which was his way of saying, I'm not going to answer you, you dummy. Why do you think I have? But the cross, of course, can be used the other way too, as the symbol of, well, martyrdom in this case, or sacrifice of some kind. It's a very complicated image, as you know. Okay, I'll take one more. How about that? Right up here. Oh, sorry, yes, sir.
I taught African American history in the public school in New Haven High School for about 28 years. And
you were part of our teacher institutes many times, my man. Go ahead.
And about 40 years ago, I did a curriculum unit for the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, and I titled that unit "The Negro Holocaust: Lynching and Race Riots in the United States, 1880 to 1950." And the use of the term Holocaust generated some controversy and offense. And I guess my question would be, would you consider lynching in America to be an American Holocaust?
You guys didn't come here to ask easy questions, did you? You must get that at EJI.
Definitely. We think a lot about language, and we wrote. I talked a little bit about the memorial at the museum and all this stuff. It all starts with the research that we did. We produced it. We put out a report in 2015, Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. It's the most comprehensive research on lynching to date. We documented about 4,400 lynchings. We uncovered actually 800 more lynchings than had been previously documented. And in that report, again, we were very intentional with the language that we use. That's why we focused on talking about these lynchings as acts of terror, because that is what they were. And that language, for some folks, was very provocative. But we were hearing from a lot of elderly African Americans who were telling us that they get frustrated when they watch the news and someone on the news is talking about how the United States is facing domestic terrorism for its first time after 9/11. And they're like, well, we grew up with terror. We grew up with the fear of being pulled out of our homes, of our children being killed and brutalized in public. And so it was something, again, that we are very kind of intentional about it with the language. And we do make a lot of parallels and connections between, what's happened in the United States and what's happened in Europe in the 20th century, what happened in Rwanda towards the end of the 20th century. But I do want us to kind of create the space to ensure that the language that we use accurately reflects these experiences. And I think, I might get in a little bit of trouble for saying this, but it is in part an indictment of the academy, the fact that it took an organization like EJI to do that kind of work and develop some of the language that we did and put it out into the world in a way that it could be engaged by the public in that way. But, again, there wasn't anything done in that kind of a way to kind of talk about this history. And so that's not really an answer to your question. But yeah, I do think that there is a need for us to really engage in this history and to, again, develop the kind of language that accurately reflects those experiences. And yeah, I'll try to really answer your question. I do think that there are very strong and deep kind of parallels in these experiences. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'll let the historians answer.
Good.
I'm going to offer
I think it is.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm going to tackle this. I thought that was a great answer, but tackle it from a slightly different angle. There are a number of historians who have tried to push back on the idea of the sort of narrative of American exceptionalism with regard to lynching, and have pointed out lynching in an international context. There have been lynchings in Mexico. You may have read about some over the last 20 years, et cetera. And I must say, I recoil at that kind of effort because while I think it's interesting to study examples of extralegal violence across many societies, and there are certainly analogies and important parallels that could be drawn, say, to pogroms in Tsarist Russia, but there are very few other modern societies, by modern I mean we'll say since 1850, few other modern societies in which extralegal violence was so centrally, so deeply embedded into the workings of the state and of justice the way they were in the United States. So at the end of the day, this is one of those subjects where I tend to push back and say, yes, all of our interest in demonstrating transnational historical events is valuable, but in this one, I do want to come back to a kind of American exceptionalism and say there's a particular brew, if you will, of American ideologies about government, about race, about democracy, about gender, that came together to create what you're calling the American Holocaust. And I think finding a language to describe that as it happened in America and acknowledging parallels perhaps with other societies at other times, but recognizing the particular history here in the United States is really important to have the kind of dialogue that Jonathan's talking about.
Hey, I might just add too, historians have played a role here, and I'm not pushing back, Jonathan, at what you said, but historians have played a role occasionally in our recent times of mass murders. Remember the Las Vegas murder, and on the radio and TV, everyone was saying this could be the largest mass murder in American history. And a lot of Reconstruction historians quickly wrote in or called in and said, no. You haven't heard of the Colfax massacre. You haven't heard of this and that, which was much larger. It's not to prove anything, except that, maybe we ought to know a little bit of history before we make these claims. And God, what do you do at the end of the day when you're comparing mass murders? Numbers are politics. They always have been. I think we're at the time here. I should also announce that at 7 p.m., which was 2 minutes ago, in Lindsley-Chittenden Hall, which is just one block from here, as part of this exhibition, you're showing the documentary film Always in Season, which is a documentary about lynching. And that's right up the street at room 102 in Lindsley-Chittenden. I want to.
Across High Street.
Yeah, it's just across High Street, right down the street and to the left. I want to especially thank this amazing panel for presenting on this issue. And thank you all for coming.